I'm the director. My name is Tess. I'm the Director of Community Strategy and Growth at HealthXL. HealthXL provides digital health advisory services and runs a global community for digital health leaders. I'm delighted to be your host for this webinar today on the topic of unlocking the value of digital measures in drug development. In late 2023, HealthXL, together with Bioformis, released a report on this exact same topic. The report focuses on taking stock of the progress that has been made with regards to utilizing digital measures in drug development and provides an expert-guided opinion on what is required to further progress in this area. We're going to spend the next hour discussing some of the main themes of the report, namely why and where does it make sense to leverage digital endpoints and for what purpose, what are barriers to the adoption of digital endpoints in drug development, and who plays a key role in helping us overcome these. The holy grail of digital measures in drug development, we're also going to talk about that, namely what is required to shift towards using digital measures as primary endpoints and supporting label claims in the future. I'd like to welcome our expert panel for this discussion, Ariel, Erwin, and Malik. And could I briefly ask you to introduce yourself to the audience? Maybe, Ariel, you can kick us off.
Sure. Hello all, my name is Ariel Dowling and I am the head of the Sensing and Measurement Group within Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And my group within Takeda focuses on implementing digital devices and digital technology within clinical programs. So any clinical team at Takeda that's interested in using a digital endpoint or using a piece of technology or using a digital device will come to us and we'll help them with that, defining exactly what the concept of interest is that they're looking to measure, what the endpoint will be. We'll help with vendor selection, and then we'll operationalize the device within the clinical program. So we get to see the end-to-end deployment of digital endpoints from the initial ideation phase all the way through to deployment, data collection, and data analysis.
Thanks, Ariel. Delighted to have you. Erwin?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Tess. And hello, everyone. Erwin de Beukelaar, based in Belgium. I work within Johnson & Johnson. I have a background in communication and user experience design. I work within J&J within the R&D quality organization. And actually, I got into this field through a collaboration with the clinical innovation team within Johnson & Johnson. I'm one of the original co-founders of the DEEP initiative for the acceleration of digital endpoints. Right now, actually, when this webinar will be over, I will actually switch to my other job, which is being a guest professor at the University of Ghent, where I'm teaching design thinking.
Nice. Many hats. Lastly, Malik?
Yeah, hi, folks. Again, Tess, thanks for having me. My name is Malik Majmudar. I'm a cardiologist, one of the co-founders and chief medical officers at Bioformis. And Bioformis is a company, we're a technology platform company, technology-enabled care delivery company with two business verticals. For the relevance for this conversation, we're very involved in exploring the discovery and use of digital measures and digital biomarkers to help pharma companies either achieve certain target endpoints or accelerate drug development, and also assist on the companion side with patient outcomes as well. Just briefly on the care delivery side, we also actually have a platform to do virtual remote care delivery, which we're finally now leveraging to actually support decentralized clinical trials.
Great. Well, thanks. And yeah, we're very, very delighted to have you. I'd just like to remind the audience that there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen. So by all means, do avail of that. We're going to hopefully keep the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and we'll hope to get through your questions as much as we can at the end. But yeah, I think a really good question to start us off is to hear from you and to understand from each one of you where you stand when it comes to alternative approaches to measuring endpoints or markers of effectiveness. Using multiple endpoints or markers obviously increases the complexity and costs of clinical trials and may require additional validation and standardization efforts. And maybe I'll start with you, Ariel, but do you agree that having alternative approaches to endpoints or markers of effectiveness is a good strategy? And specifically, how do digital measures fit into such a strategy?
Sure. I mean, it's a little bit of preaching to the choir, but obviously I do support the use of digital endpoints for clinical programs. But the reason is because the goal of a clinical program is to understand the safety and efficacy of a novel drug, right? The entire goal of what you're trying to do with the clinical program is to determine, does this drug work? And the FDA has a criteria. Does the drug help how the patient feels, functions, or survives? And so everything we do, any endpoint we use in a clinical program is specifically focused on one of those three areas. How does it improve how the patient feels, functions, and survives? That's what we're looking for efficacy. And so it's not so much that it's a digital endpoint, is that these digital endpoints enable us to determine new ways to understand how a patient feels, functions, or survives. Before when we were doing just in-clinic assessments, just, paper assessments, et cetera, we could only get a snapshot of how the patient feels and functions during the day. But as we all know, what happens on a single day may not generalize to the entire trial or may not show the true changes in the person's lifestyle. And as a result of the use of, more high fidelity clinical endpoints, now we can understand through the use of digital devices how patients are feeling and functioning at home. How are they sleeping? What is their daily activity being affected? Are they going out more? Are they leaving their house more? Are they more active during the day? Are they getting back to natural activities of daily living? Has their sleep improved? All these are questions that help us answer, is this drug having the desired effect on the patients, and are we able to alleviate the symptoms or potentially stop progression of their disease? So that's really the goal here of these alternative endpoints. It's to give us a more accurate view of how the patient is feeling, functioning, or surviving, and therefore a more accurate view of how the drug under evaluation is affecting these patients. And that's what's really valuable about the use of alternative endpoints. It's giving us better, more frequent, more consistent, less variable data on the patient's health so we can make a more informed decision, and ultimately so that the regulatory bodies can make a more informed decision as to which drugs they move forward and they approve for use.
Thanks, Ariel.
Hey, Ariel, just one comment, housekeeping stuff. For some reason, we're getting a lot of noise through the microphone. It's very crackly. I don't know if you need an external microphone or not. You want to switch it. I think a bunch of audience members are commenting on the feedback.
Okay, give me 1 minute. I'll run and go get it. I'll be right back.
Perfect, thanks.
Well, maybe while we wait on Ariel to get back, maybe Erwin, you want to tell us about your
Yeah, well, I was thinking very much along the line of Ariel actually for that question, Tess, but I really wonder if we should still call it alternative approaches or alternative endpoints. I really think that it's about having the right marker, having the right measure, and it's really going to depend from, let's say, what is it that you would like to prove in your clinical trial that should determine what actually the measure is that you want to use. Yeah, regardless whether it's digital or not. Yeah. I think the nice thing, and I think Ariel, if I could understand her well, already pointed out that as well, that is that the nice thing about these digital endpoints is that they allow us to track, let's say, activities of daily living. They really allow us to look into people's lives. And so there is a convenience. We no longer have to bring them to the clinic, for instance. We can do passive measurements. We can more measurement over a way longer time. I mean, these are for me the key differentiators.
Molly.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take a slightly different lens to this. I mean, the question really was, are these novel approaches, alternative approaches, even, what's the rationale for them? And I think the way I think about this in the product landscape, there's a very common saying that if you're launching a new product, it better be better, faster, cheaper, right? So we think about this idea of digital measures. The way I think about this is like there are three different ways we can utilize them, or the reasons why you should utilize them. In terms of the better part, I think we all know that traditional measures of endpoints are highly they're sort of gross and not really, don't have high resolution sometimes. And novel technologies, as Ariel mentioned, for the first time, gives you an opportunity to go a lot deeper into the phenotyping of some of these, either function or physiology, So the idea is that there are certain types of digital biomarkers that truly give you a better look and a better insight into function or physiology. And that's one reason when we want to use a digital biomarker is just a better way of doing things, right? It gives you new insights that were not possible before. The faster part is really around, could you accelerate what you traditionally used to do through traditional brick and mortar clinic visits, where you had to physically go in and do a certain test? Could you capture the same information in a remote or virtual environment that gives you ability to accelerate and lower the cost of that sort of data collection? And then the cheaper part is, of course, around cost. And we all recognize the cost of clinical trials have exponentially increased over the last decade or two. And there's a real reason to think about affordability of medications and how do you drive costs down. Well, part of it is clinical trials. So some of these digital biomarkers, digital measures really allow you to lower the cost of capturing and validating these tools, and ultimately drives the cost of the whole drug. So I think, to me, that's the way I rationalize the role of digital measures. Is it has to be better, faster, or cheaper. It doesn't have to be all three. It's obviously a home run if it's all three, but even one of those three is still a very valid justification for why you want to use them.
Ariel, do we want to quickly try your microphone?
Yes, hopefully I'm on a headset now, so it should be good. I do apologize for that. We didn't pick it up in the initial testing to the attendees.
You're coming through perfectly. Okay, that's awesome. Well, thank you for that. I think there's some really nice value statements that each one of you have listed. I think some really clearly compelling uses and rationales. But what I'm curious to understand a bit is, how do you currently use digital measures the most? What would you say is their kind of predominant use currently?
Well, I'm happy to start. I'm sure all of us have a lot of experiences in the space. I mean, I think in terms of current use, I would say a vast majority of digital measures are probably what people call COAs, right? Clinical outcomes assessments, and how using mobile applications and digital versions of physical analog sort of surveys and questionnaires and ePros to capture information from patients in a more frequent basis or in a remote basis. I think that's actually quite common. I think as you get to the more interesting part of digital measures is digital biomarkers. I think there's a lot of activity in the research and development space on digital biomarkers. I would say it's still in the research and development phase. So I think the clinical formal application of digital biomarkers for drug approval is probably still very nascent. I think there's been a couple of attempts, but it's very nascent. I think at Bioformis, we've had a number of activities that are more focused on digital biomarkers, more so than just digital measures of COAs around surveys. But we can get into in the future in the rest of the conversation around some examples of those.
In your kind of view?
Yeah, maybe to that point, Malik, I was also looking at it from a different perspective, in the sense that, let's say, I mean, there are reasons, let's say, why from a pharma perspective we choose, let's say, for certain outcome assessments, certain biomarkers. But I also would like to voice here, let's say, why we would apply it, let's say, from a patient perspective. And that is that, I mean, I'm such a believer in these digital endpoints because they really have the ability to measure what is really truly relevant for a patient. Yeah. The example that I often use here within J&J is for patients with pulmonary hypertension. These are people from whom it has become impossible to really participate in any daily activities of life. Yeah. So if you ask these patients what's relevant for you, they will tell you, well, that I can do my groceries, or that I would be able to vacuum clean. Yeah. But as a physician, I mean, vacuum cleaning or doing groceries is not a typical endpoint that you would look at in the clinic. Yeah. They would allow you maybe to do a 6-minute walk test. Yeah. Which is only a very small time frame in which that you're capturing data at a very specific interval and frequency. Yeah. So again, having, let's say, these, well, truly understand what is relevant for a patient in their disease progression or even in their curation. I mean, that's for me the most compelling aspect.
Building onto that, everything that they've said is absolutely true. But there is another value that that we've seen within Takeda internally, and that is helping to make a decision as to whether or not to advance a drug forward from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 2 to phase 3. So, one of the biggest challenges within a pharma company is deciding whether or not your drug should move on from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 2 to phase 3 based on efficacy. So the early phase studies, phase 1, phase 2 studies are powered on safety. So the goal there is to make sure the drug is safe, to make sure it does no harm, and all the endpoints are based around safety to make sure everything is safe. But as a result, it's usually not powered for enough subjects or a long enough duration to truly test efficacy. That's what the phase 3 program is for. The phase 3 program really shows the efficacy, and that's what the registrational trial is, as well as additional safety endpoints, of course. Where digital devices can help is making that difficult decision as to whether or not the drug is showing promise to move from phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3. And it's not always clear from the traditional endpoints whether or not the drug is really effective, or how it's effective, or how much it's effective, et cetera. So by using a digital endpoint with smaller number of subjects and a shorter duration measurement time, you can get an early read on that efficacy for the drug, and hopefully allow you to make a better decision is to move more promising drugs forward faster, or to stop development on drugs that really aren't showing promise. And in doing that, it allows us to test more drugs. It allows us to bring more candidates to market, to offer, have more early phase studies, and hopefully bring newer therapies to patients faster. So there's a huge benefit to patients, as everyone has said, but there's also a real benefit in the process of drug development that digital endpoints can bring to a pharma company in making those challenging decisions in early phase programs.
If I may, I want to pick up the thread from Erwin a little bit here, because I think this is one of the opportunities and challenges of digital measures and biomarkers. I think, Erwin, you made a fantastic point, right? All of us agree here that clearly having the ability to capture patients in their free living, in their home environment, to capture the change in function functionality is a critical factor in looking at the efficacy of certain things. The challenge, though, becomes in the fact that at an individual patient level, that activity subtype that you refer to may be different for different patients. So there's a vacuum cleaning for one patient, you may be going to the grocery store for a different patient, or it may be something else for a third patient. The 6-minute walk test, as cumbersome as it is, at least is standardized. And how do you marry personalization and value to an individual patient with a measure that's generalizable and standardizable across, because it still has to be generalizable for an endpoint for a clinical trial. And this is where we did a clinical trial in partnership with the FDA and Mayo and Yale, looking at an alternative measure of 6-minute walk test. We literally did this with a wrist-worn wearable and an upper arm wearable. And the FDA was very interested to say, hey, are there other ways to capture physical function in the home environment that doesn't require you to capture a 6-minute walk test? So I think you could capture step count, gait speed, multiple different derivatives of accelerometer signals. But then the question becomes, which one will you pick to validate to then become the endpoint? I think that, to me, that's a huge opportunity, but it's also a little bit of a challenge, because then you want to make sure you can do that before you say this is an endpoint I want to move forward with as an endpoint in a clinical trial, in a phase 3 trial.
Okay. I think I'll get back to some more, these case studies, but yeah, I think, Ariel, your example was really interesting of sort of how you use it for that kind of earlier decision making. I think that's a very compelling use case. But this kind of brings me to a different question. Given sort of the nascency of some of this and sort of the exploratory nature of much of this as well, who are the right stakeholders to engage with to really meaningfully apply digital measures in trials? Like, how do you begin a conversation? Like, how does it start?
Ariel, you want to take that?
Sure. So our view is always to start with what essentially the problem is, or the concepts of interest. So when we work with clinical teams, we work with them to really boil down what that concept of interest is that they're looking for. And it always starts with the patient. So for example, one example might be, I'm having insomnia. I can't sleep anymore. I have, incredible difficulty sleeping. I'm no longer this, my symptoms are keeping me up at night, and I can't get a full night's rest. I'm always tired. So we say, okay, that's the meaningful aspect of health for the patient. And from there we move to, okay, the concept of interest is sleep, right? So sleep is something that's very important to these patients. And so then we ask the clinical team, is it important to you to understand how the patient sleeps? Like, is it important to the patient how the patient feels, functions, and survives? Is it important to, we know it's important to the patient. Do we think that this particular drug is going to have an effect on the patient's sleep? And is this data that you want to collect? And if that's something that say, yes, we need to understand this data in order to understand our patient's progression through the disease, then we say, okay, let's bring that down again, because sleep is not something that I can measure. I can measure number of hours slept. I can measure sleep opportunity. I can measure a number of nighttime awakenings. I can measure time in REM sleep. I can measure sleep onset. I can measure sleep wake. Which one of those are the actual outcomes you're interested in? And so then I'll work with them to really boil down to exactly what the question is that they want answered. And we don't even talk devices. We never talk digital endpoints or devices until we know what the question is that we're looking to answer. Because now I know whatever device I choose or whatever modality we choose to measure it, I'm going to be providing data back to the clinical team that answers a question that's of critical importance to them and is important to how the patient feels, functions, and survives. And so that's really how you get to the right outcome measure. And once you get to the right outcome measure, that will lead you to the right device, and that will lead you to the right digital endpoint. And that's how we sort of make sure that anything we're doing with digital endpoints brings value back to the patient and brings value back to the clinical program. Because we always start with the question of, what do you need? It's never a good idea to go in with saying, hey, I've got this new toy. Let's check out the new toy and try it out. No. We're trying to answer questions about patients' health here. And we want to make sure everything is tied back to the patient and tied back to understanding more about them and about how this experimental drug is affecting them. And so that's how we work through the process of getting to the specific outcome measure we want to measure. And then from there, we can move to which digital device properly quantifies this outcome measure, and we'll work with the protocol, and we'll work with the patient population and has the right deployment and can work in the right geographies and things like that.
It's just to build on what Ariel said. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I would say another framework one could apply to this is to think about, you talked about earlier a little bit of definitions. You can think about digital measures as things that are capturing clinical outcomes assessments like COAs, or things that are truly biomarkers. In the world of biomarkers, there are subtypes, right? There's diagnostic, there's monitoring, there's safety, there's predictive, there's prognostic. So I think depending on where you are, to Ariel's point, like what the need is, you may have a different set of stakeholders you have to engage to ensure, for example, one is there biological plausibility. Well, you may have to involve the clinical and the scientists to say, hey, what I'm measuring, is there enough plausibility here to make sure this measure is a sufficient or appropriate measure to be correlating to something that you're used to doing. If it's something else, you may have to think about from a clinical trial perspective, physician acceptance. Will clinicians eventually accept that measure as a tool that they want to potentially trust, have confidence in, to potentially use in the clinical care setting, management setting versus R&D setting? And of course, it's always the regulatory bodies to say, what is the substantial evidence behind this measure? Is it been validated enough to be able to test it in a clinical trial where they will accept that as a surrogate, primary, secondary, exploratory endpoint, so we're making forward progress, right? So I think a lot of that depends on where you are in the journey, and then what the evidence is to substantiate what level of maturity that biomarker or digital measure has to be used in different clinical trials, whether it be early phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trials.
I'd love to hear from each of you one example of where you have used digital measures in a meaningful capacity. I know you've sort of, given a couple of mini examples, but yeah, if I could just get you to really focus on one example where you have realized maybe one of the value statements that we kind of discussed early on. I think that'd be really valuable for the audience.
I'm happy to start, Tess, and it's always tricky, let's say, to bring things at a public webinar with lawyers around the corner. But the example that I would like to draw on, to actually appeal to the value statement, but also to some of the complexities. I think that most people here will be familiar, let's say, with the example of nocturnal scratching in atopic dermatitis. Yeah. The reason that I picked this example is because, let's say, the definition of what nocturnal and scratch meant, was actually being researched by a consortium led by Dime Society. And just, I think, by involving pharma companies, academic institutions, patient advocacy groups, and J&J was, by the way, one of the contributors. I mean, having a broad coalition there really allowed to create an ontology of what nocturnal and scratch means. Yeah. And just as a side note, in the final definition, yeah, nocturnal scratch is also happening during the day, yeah, because scratching was broader than just at night. Yeah, I think the interesting thing here is that for some of these measures, there is really some groundbreaking work needed in order to really understand what it is that we want to measure. And when I say we, it's also we as an industry. Yeah. So just to avoid that there is a J&J flavor of nocturnal scratch and Takeda's version of nocturnal scratch and so on. Now, what maybe not everyone knows is that actually the work that was done at Dime to sort of create definitions was actually taken further by a couple of the same companies, including J&J, to actually bring this to EMA. And right now in a collaboration with the DEEP organization, we're running together an ITF procedure, yeah, to actually seek to see if we can get through collaboration a joint qualification advice for this particular digital endpoint. And that is, I think, the really next step, yeah, is how can we jointly collaborate as farm companies to approach the health authorities and at least show that we are agreeing on what we want to measure and how we that it could actually be measured. Yeah.
Yeah, many people are obviously familiar with that example, so it's a great one. Thank you. Malik, I think you came up.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I was gonna mention the example of the 6-minute walk test, but I already used that one. I'll give you another example, which is a paper was just published 2 days ago in Nature Digital Medicine that looked at the use of a wearable. It happened to be biopharmacist wearable. The study started 4 years ago, so we sort of forgot about it. But they actually really published this paper looking at the use of mobile and wearable data among patients with multiple sclerosis in the free living environment. And they tracked these patients for a very long time. They were able to clearly demonstrate not only could you discriminate between patients with multiple sclerosis from the healthy controls, but within the population of MS, they were able to look at multiple subtypes of patients with different patterns of movement. And you know, in MS, you have this idea of flares that happen, you know, episodically. So you have normal function, you have this exacerbation, and you go normal again. And they're able to clearly discriminate based on wearable data and mobile data, which they collected symptom survey from the digital measure from the mobile app. They collected wearable data from accelerometer and step count and gait and other parameters. And it also had clinical measures from the EMR that it correlated with. So they had a lot of real data. And I think it's a really good example of how we could actually truly track, not just from a diagnostic perspective, healthy versus MS, among patients with MS, response to therapy and progression of disease over time using this data. So I think it's a really good example, a real world example of how this could be used. And to Ariel's point earlier, if you had this tool at an early stage clinical trial, you could try to discriminate the cohorts of patients who were responders and non-responders to try to get to a better sample size for these really large, expensive clinical trials. Right? It's like there's many ways to use this tool to apply to the drug development or even for disease therapeutic management and monitoring post-surveillance. Right?
Another great example. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have one, and it's also going to answer the question on the chat about what exactly are examples where digital measure has helped accelerate the decision of a sponsor from early to late development. So about 4 years ago, there was a study that was being run at Takeda where it was a phase 2b study, which means that it was a drug that had been shown to be safe in one indication, and that based on the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and mechanism of action, the clinical team felt it could potentially benefit a different patient population, in this case, Parkinson's disease. Now, they hadn't run a phase 1 study on the Parkinson's disease patients because it was a phase 2b. This is looking for a new indication, looking for a different use of a drug that had already been shown to be safe. So they wanted to run a small scale phase 2b to see, okay, can this drug help Parkinson's disease patients. And the hypothesis, based on the mechanism of action of the drug and the type of molecule it was that the molecule would help in one of two ways. It would help with the cognitive aspects of Parkinson's disease, or it would help with the kinematic aspects of Parkinson's disease. Specifically, it could reduce the risk of falls and improve the vestibular system so that the patients would fall less. And the question was really, does it help in both domains, both cognition and movement? Does it help in just one? Does it help in neither? We didn't know, but we weren't at the point where we could run a very large scale phase study. We needed a small study with just a few subjects. I believe the number was about 65 subjects was the target. Could we tell with a small number of subjects whether or not this drug would help in either of these two domains? And for cognition, it was relatively straightforward to figure out, what tests we needed to run. But the movement aspect was challenging because falls and detecting falling is an extremely difficult metric to measure. It's something that we almost do exclusively with EPROs. We ask the patients, okay, how often did you fall? When did you fall? But we know from previous studies of EPROs that fall diaries are very unreliable because falls don't happen all that often. They don't happen every day. Even someone who's very prone to falling might only fall once a month, and that would be considered a very high risk of falling because of how rare falls events are. And patients tend to downplay, was it a fall? Oh, I caught myself. Oh, it was just a stumble. You know what I mean? So the question of what is a fall is actually a very open question. So what we did find in the literature was that there was a lot of evidence showing that measuring gait, specifically measuring gait variability, was a very strong predictor of falls and risk of falling. If you have a much higher variability in your gait, you are at much greater risk of falling, and you will fall more in the upcoming year to 2 years. So we said, well, we can measure gait variability. That's something that we can measure in a small scale study in a cohort of 65 patients and determine over a very short period of time whether or not this drug is affecting gait variability. And therefore, as a biomarker, it would then affect falls, which would show whether or not the drug was being efficacious. So we used an in-clinic high frequency gait measurement system that consisted of 6 digital devices placed on the patients and would quantify a wide variety of gait metrics about the patients, including this gait variability. And we were able to run the study in a short period of time with a small number of subjects to make a determination as to whether or not the drug was effective in the cognition domain, in the movement domain, in any domain, to make a decision as to whether or not we were going to move forward with the drug. So the paper is going to come out soon on that. Unfortunately, I can't give the results away, as Erwin said, on a public webinar, but hopefully the paper will be published this year to show whether or not the drug was effective in one or both domains. But this is a great example that I felt of doing a study that would not have been able to been run without a digital device. We would never have been able to measure this falls and fall risks without the use of a digital device, as well as on such a small sample size and in a short period of time to make that determination as to whether we should move forward.
That's a great, really great case study. We'll, keep an eye out for the paper for sure. I suppose using measures to identify suitable patients for clinical trials is an especially promising use case in the rare disease space. Would you be able to explain this potential benefit to the audience? Really, I'm trying to kind of, bring it home a little bit or bring it closer a little bit more. What does this mean for kind of trial timelines, trial costs? Just really wanting to talk through some of the benefits here.
Yeah, I don't know, Ariel or Erwin, you have more experience with this. At Bioformance, we have less experience in truly rare diseases. But I think maybe I could just overarching comment here, which is that one of the challenges with rare disease populations is, of course, in any specific geographic location, there's very few patients available for clinical trials. And of course, they don't always have to be in urban settings. And as you know, it's very difficult to enroll and retain patients in clinical trials that are in rural settings or far away. This idea of decentralized trials combined with digital measures, really one of the things it can do is affordability to actually collect information and collect data and specific types of data in those kind of settings to, again, accelerate the trial completion and the speed and cost of those trials. That's one obvious one. I think from a physiology perspective, specific digital biomarker perspective, obviously it depends a lot on the specific disease mechanism, underlying biology, and do you have measures that are relevant to that specific biology? Right? To Ariel's point earlier on, you start with the problem, not the tool, right? There's lots of tools available. If the problem is such that you don't have a tool to measure it, it's not going to help throwing these tools at it. So I think you start with the biological plausibility, physiological relevance, And then you go to really the tools that map to those to accelerate the pathway.
Yeah, I personally think that the rare disease space is one of the best opportunities for digital biomarkers and digital endpoints. And the reason is because many of these diseases, because they are rare, don't have endpoints that were developed specifically for this disease. So a lot of times a rare disease is using endpoints that were developed for a different type of disease. And they just say, okay, well, the 6-minute walk test worked for this type of disease, so we'll just use it for this one, even if it's never been validated on those patients or shown to affect how the patient feels, functions, or survives. And the clinicians know this, and they're very unhappy about it. You know, they want endpoints developed for their patients, but just the cost and the time and the difficulty of getting these patients really has limited the amount of disease-specific endpoints that were developed for rare disease patients. And I think this is one of the areas where digital endpoints can really help, because we can develop targeted endpoints that take in the specific symptoms of that disease and come up with an endpoint that pulls in all the specific symptoms and all the specific measurements we want to do for this disease specifically, and really understand how the patients are progressing, and not use an endpoint that was developed for a different indication. So we worked on a project earlier this year on a rare disease called Fabry disease, which has a variety of different symptoms for it. But the one symptom that we were very interested in was that as a result of the disease, the patients are unable to sweat. So they cannot produce sweat. And this actually causes a huge issue with the patient's quality of life, because they avoid situations where they would sweat because the inability to sweat causes them physical pain. They'll avoid exercise. They'll avoid emotional settings. They'll avoid hot climates. They just avoid going anywhere that could potentially produce a sweating response, and even avoid emotionally charged situations, you know? And that this is something that really affected their quality of life, but there's no endpoint on the market that can measure sweat and sweat initiation, and there didn't exist. There isn't an approved one. It's not approved for Fabry disease. But we know from our use of our digital devices that an EDA sensor, an electrodermal activity sensor, is an excellent type of sensor that can actually measure this particular symptom. The way an EDA sensor works makes it such that it's very well suited to measure the initiation of sweat, not the quantity of sweat, but the start of sweat. Or is the patient sweating? Is the patient not sweating? And so we did an early proof of concept study to determine, could you use an EDA sensor to distinguish between high and low sweating individuals, with the goal of potentially progressing on to maybe having an endpoint on this to look at continuous sweat initiation to see, okay, for Fabry patients, if they were to wear an EDA sensor continuously, would we be able to tell before and after therapy if they've actually restored natural sweating activities with this particular drug? So that was an indication of there was no endpoint exists. We don't have an endpoint on sweating, but it was very important to this particular patient population. And I could see something like that moving forward to say, okay, in a rare disease like Fabry, having a digital device to custom create this endpoint would be highly beneficial, again, to how the patient feels, functions, or survives, and will be very well accepted to both the patients and the KOLs in the community.
Ariel, maybe I'm going to ask you a question if I can, Tess, because I think I find it is a really interesting area. I'm not that familiar with it myself, but I do see the value, let's say, of creating specific endpoints for rare diseases. What worries me is that when you already, let's say, have a very small patient population, the effort, let's say, to going to develop the endpoint, to deploy it, yeah, is still going to be as significant or maybe even more difficult than, let's say, within a larger population. So, I mean, I do get, let's say, that we need to develop our endpoints for the specific use cases where we want to use them, yeah. But I think that if we continue to develop highly specific endpoints for highly specific use cases, the effort to create them, to validate them, to develop the solutions for it, yeah. I mean, if we don't seek sort of a way to sort of reuse endpoints, reuse solutions, reuse evidence, yeah, I mean, it's going to be stay a very expensive business for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think that's an absolute consideration to take into account. One of the things that in discussions with the regulators we have talked about is that they are willing to allow through endpoints for rare diseases with, I would say, smaller sample sizes, less validation, et cetera, than they would for a larger patient population, for exactly all the reasons that you take through. And I do think that's one of the things where the FDA has signaled an openness to potentially looking at that. The EMA has already shown with their approval of the 95th centile stride velocity for a rare disease, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, that they are willing to take basically take the endpoint on solid evidence, but not the very large evidentiary package they typically require for an endpoint for something like Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's that we as a community should probably test, right? To see, okay, we know it's a rare disease. Like you said, we can't follow the same package because it would be an expensive proposition and these endpoints would never get developed if we had to go through the entire process. Will you accept a lower level of subjects, shorter subject time, et cetera, if we show that the endpoint really matters to these patients?
Well,
and it's an open question.
Yeah. It's an open question for me too. It's on the one hand, let's say, what is the threshold that you are using, but also can we find, let's say, a way to maybe reuse some of the evidence that was generated in one use case, yeah,
Right.
and then
Absolutely.
actually bring it into another use case or use it for another pathway. I mean, so that we can, let's say, leverage, let's say, the knowledge that already exists, and that should then accelerate any development of new endpoints.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that hopefully the regulators are open to, is to take in an evidentiary package from one rare disease, showing the similarity to another rare disease, and then moving on from there.
If we could spend maybe a couple of minutes on this topic, Tess, I think it's just such a critical topic, right? It's like the crux of the conversation, which is like the big elephant in the room. Nobody talks about is like, how do we make these digital measures that all of us have been talking about in a mostly exploratory internal R&D way to truly become the endpoint for some of these drug approvals or larger trials? And I think the analogy would be, historically speaking, there are digital measures, and this happens to be a survey, but there are measures that have been approved by the FDA to be the primary endpoint in clinical trials. The example, of course, being KCCQ questionnaire and the Kansas City Heart Failure Questionnaire as an official formal endpoint for drug approvals in heart failure. And as well as a six-minute walk test for pulmonary hypertension is an approved endpoint as well. But it took years, close to a decade, for some of these measures to actually become accepted by the FDA. We don't want to spend another 10 to 15 years getting a new digital measure approved by the FDA. So the question is, how do we think about the timeline and pathway to get some of these newer measures actually accepted by both physicians who are prescribing and who are managing patients, but also by the FDA for drug approvals? And I think, to me, the question that you raised, Erwin, is interesting about collaboration and sharing of data, because the reality that each one of us individually won't be able to invest enough resources to independently validate every single one of these measures across multiple populations, right? It's a classic drug approval. It's like a multi-hundred million, multi-year pathway. So how do we think about, there's so many trials right now in clinicaltrials.gov with the use of wearables and digital measures and endpoints being collected. Is there a way to have this kind of, pre-competitive consortia that says those measures and tools are actually available to investigate and discover other patterns of data and physiology and endpoints that potentially can be used cross-reference or leverage for each other? I think we have to think about something like that, or it'll just take too long. There won't be enough sample sizes in any given indication, any given company, any given startup, just do it all alone. And there's not enough funding to do that. So I think that's an interesting opportunity area for me to think about how do we start collaborating.
Absolutely, Malik. And to that point, when we were developing the deep ID within J&J, we were creating sort of what we call the anatomy of a digital measurement solution. Yeah. So there is always going to be a definition component. Yeah. And then there is going to be a solution component that measures something. Yeah. And then there is going to be evidence. But actually, each of these three pieces can be modularized. Yeah, you can have one definition that can multiple solutions. One solution can maybe have can accommodate maybe different endpoints. So cataloging all of, let's say, these relations that exist between endpoint solutions and evidence. I mean, if you do that systematically, then you really accumulate, let's say, the collective knowledge that we have as human beings around these digital measures.
I do think that the bigger tent approach is going to be what moves us forward here. From a pharma company perspective, we're not looking to compete on endpoints. We're not looking to develop our own novel proprietary endpoints that only Takeda can use, because that's not a benefit to us and it's not a benefit to the community. It works better for us when everyone uses the same endpoint. And honestly, my guess is that for the regulatory bodies too, seeing multiple major pharma companies who all work in the same disease state come together with KOLs, with patients, and saying, hey, this new endpoint in Parkinson's disease, we feel is the right one to add as a secondary endpoint because of these reasons. Them seeing that consensus approach and seeing that community approach where all the different stakeholders agree on a single endpoint is what they're really looking for. You know, they're looking for, we know they're looking for new endpoints because everyone's unhappy with the UPDRS, right? You know, there's a million papers written about the unhappiness of the UPDRS Part 3 motor score, but no one settled on the single endpoint that we can all agree is a good replacement. And but there are many people working on it. And once there's more of that group consensus, that's where it's going to move forward quicker. That's where when we get a bunch of people who've done a lot of different studies and, you know, completely independent studies showing, yes, this endpoint measures disease progression, measures how the patient feels, functions, and survives. And we all feel that this is the next best endpoint for this particular disease state, that's when we'll move forward there. And I do think those pre-competitive consortia are critical to getting that consensus, to bringing those groups together, to deciding on what the endpoint is and which one should be brought forward towards the regulatory bodies. That's what's going to move the field forward. I don't know of any that have tried it recently, to be honest. I don't know of anyone who's gone to say, hey, with a group consensus saying, let's all go behind it. But I do think in Parkinson's disease, as well as Erwin said, in nocturnal scratch, there is building momentum behind this as an endpoint. There's a lot of companies working in nocturnal scratch for atopic dermatitis and psoriasis. There's a lot of focus on that. This to me seems like the best case opportunity to say, okay, we know we have all these different studies, we have all these independent studies with all this parallel types of data showing nocturnal scratch can measure something different in atopic dermatitis and progressive disease state. Let's go as a unit to the regulatory bodies to ask for that approval.
And I think that is what's happening right now with internal scratch going to the European Medicines Agency. The next step will be FDA. I think that's going to be another interesting journey there. Yeah. But I think it's interesting, let's say, for the companies that participate in these collaborations to also share, let's say, on a broader scale what their experiences are, so that more people understand, let's say, what the benefits are of acting in a non-competitive space around these digital measures.
Right. And I was going to say, Ariel, to your point, I mean, nocturnal scratch is a great example. The other one I'm aware of, at least, that there's a lot of momentum right now is around cytokine release syndrome for CAR T therapies. It's a lot of interest. There was DIME, the Digital Medicine Society, put together this consortia that included the regulators, FDA, HHS, but also a bunch of pharma companies and startups to come together to figure out what's the right ontology definitions and what's the right monitoring technology and the endpoints we may want to align on for digital measures, digital biomarkers for CRS prediction and CRS monitoring. So I think that's another area in oncology. It's also a high priority right now.
On the point of adoption, I think you've each kind of inadvertently, spoke about the role of regulators, but I'm curious, who are the other stakeholders that really crucially need to buy into this? I'm thinking kind of the physician community, but I'm sure there's others, and what's your take on that?
Well, I think the one that hasn't really been named here are payers. Yeah. And I mean, I think the digital endpoints have so many potential, let's say, for digital medicine as a whole, yeah. And I certainly would not want to give the impression here in this webinar that it only serves a purpose in clinical trials, yeah. But I think that's just the place where they are now being used. But the real value, yeah, is going to be once they end up in clinical care, yeah. And may be able, let's say, to enable them sort of value-based healthcare, value-based pricing, where there is real-world evidence enabled by these digital measures beyond their initial approval. Yeah, I mean that's where the real competition should be happening between pharma companies.
Yeah, I feel like there's two areas that come to mind for me, Tess. One is on the R&D side, quite frankly, we can talk about as a stakeholder, pharma companies themselves. As Ariel, as you know, it's not ubiquitous that every company is so open-minded about digital measures in their pathways. They are exploring it, but there is concerns around using it in phase 3 trials, or because it affects potentially the drug's future, the promise of the drug. So there's still a little bit of skepticism around using this, both from a cost perspective, but also from a potentially what do you find out from the results and what insights you'll gain from it. So there's still not 100% adoption there. I think I agree, Erwin, from your point, which is the real benefit to me is on the management of the patient, right? So the evidentiary pathway for payers is usually a lot higher because they want to see a reduction in cost or some value where they can see a ROI from a pure cost of care perspective. But really, that's where I think is the most valuable is to say, even if a drug is FDA cleared on a specific digital endpoint, doesn't necessarily mean it'll get approved and paid for by the payers until they see the results from a functionality, cost of care, or outcomes perspective. So I think that's a whole another layer of evidence generation beyond just drug approvals.
Yeah, and I don't think the endpoints will necessarily be the same, right? Like an endpoint that's used to demonstrate efficacy of a treatment may not be the same endpoint that we use in general clinical care to show reduction of hospitalizations or, improvement of quality of life, et cetera. I do think in some ways the bar could be lower because what you're looking for is different. You're looking for, has the patient's life improved? Are they going to the physician less? You able to, it's a cost question. So are they able to reduce hospitalizations, et cetera? So in some ways it's easier to measure than pure efficacy, but in other ways it's harder because you're using now real world evidence. Using real world evidence is much more challenging than clinical trials data. Clinical trials data tends to be very sanitized, very standard. It's one of the reasons why we do it and we run a clinical trial to create a very standard set of evidentiary package. Whereas real world evidence is messy. You have a lot of missing data, you have a lot of partial data, you have a lot of sporadic data, et cetera. And so that's a different type of endpoint. And again, some of the endpoints may translate and some of them may not, but it's important to not turn that down because there is a lot of benefit to these real world evidence studies, these phase 4 studies to generate, again, how the patient is functioning and surviving after approval in the, especially for chronic conditions for the years that they're taking the drug.
Before there's some really good questions in the Q&A, but before we go there, I just very quickly wanted to ask one last question, and that is really, in this space where I suppose, pharmaceutical companies, as much as digital health companies, really, play a pivotal role in many ways, the kind of capabilities are, they exist in pockets, but they're probably not as democratized maybe as they should be. So I think, that collaboration between pharmaceutical companies and digital health companies is really crucial. But I'm really keen to understand, is this a viable business for startups to get into, and what is that opportunity?
I'll start with the only startup in this panel here. I do believe it's a huge opportunity, actually. I think the amount of diseases and the amount of clinical trials happening every single day where there's a need for better monitoring, better measurement, better prediction ability still out there. And I think a lot of these conditions, even in the rare diseases, there's so many more common diseases. They're still looking for better insights and better digital measures. I think that's clearly a path there. The challenge is, of course, as a startup, you have to be able to survive. So the adoption curve of all these is slow for pharma companies, and the regulatory bodies don't accept this, then you don't have the runway to wait 5, 7, 10 years for it to get adopted. So you have to be strategic and targeted in which measures and which partnerships you really prioritize. I think that's a prioritization question, but no doubt in my mind that this vertical of digital measures and digital biomarkers is clearly one that the next 10 to 20 years is going to be very, very promising. It's just being very strategic about it.
I think Malika, it's not only, let's say, in developing the solutions, but also in providing services to create the definitions, to help do patient research, etc. One thing that I always remembered when I attended one of the HealthXL face-to-face events where you mingle as big pharma with startups is where someone from a startup said, I think it was a CEO, said, well, we have this huge problem of pilotitis, where every big pharma first want to do a pilot with a startup, and for the startup, that's really literally that pilot may be their lifeline, So I think there is also a huge mind shift that we need to be aware of as big pharma companies, that if we want this to be a viable ecosystem, if we want to be, let's say, the solution be brought to us to be that we can use in our endpoints, we should also, let's say, take care of these startups and find viable ways to actually work with them, so that they can actually survive, and get rid of the pilotitis disease.
You know, in my career, I've moved between startups and pharma, and it's been an interesting transition going from one to the other and kind of seeing both sides of it. And I think the short answer is there's always new technology. Like there's always a new sensor, there's always a new technology, there's always a new way of measuring things, right? You know, when I started, I used motion sensors only, and it was just movement analysis. Now we're looking at measuring non-invasive blood pressure using, you know, really high-powered PPGs that wasn't even feasible with the sensors and the technology we had 10 years ago. So I think that there's always new opportunities for tech. There's always new opportunities for taking existing tech and, you know, moving it into the healthcare sphere. And so there's always going to be new startups coming up. And the question is, how do you support that in the ecosystem? As both Oren and Malik said, that's a little more challenging than the, you know, deploying a new social media app. So it's how can we keep this ecosystem alive?
I like that. One question, Malik, is directed at you, and it's just asking you to double click on the 6-minute walking test
Sure.
study, yeah, with the FDA and what
Devices. Yeah, the devices, we used 2 devices in that study, just for those who want to look it up. It's we used the Apple Watch as well as our own Averion, which is a continuous wearable device. We're trying to correlate also signals from both devices to the gold standard 6-minute walk test.
Thanks. And I think the question from Kimberly, just the very top one there, I think is a really good one to maybe end this webinar on. So the question reads, from your perspective, what variables are holding back pharma and clinical stakeholders from extracting the full value presented by digital biomarkers? What's needed to scale digital biomarkers beyond R&D? I think if I could get each of you to comment on this as a sort of a closing, I think that's a really powerful one.
You guys want to take the pharma point of view? I'll end with the clinical point of view.
I think there is an element of risk. You know, big pharma tends to be conservative. We are conservative, or, you know, we have to be conservative, right? We are playing with patients' lives here. You know, like many of our patients are very, very sick, and we need to make sure that the drugs we're putting out there are safe and effective, and that the additional things we ask them to do are not going to be too burdensome for them. So there's always a push and pull in between innovation and conservatism, and I think one of the things that would really help is getting that more regulatory approval for it. You know, like pharma tends to look for the standard benchmark. So seeing more regulatory approval of digital endpoints, seeing the FDA being more open, seeing the FDA putting together a new advisory board on digital health, all of these things signal that they're willing to take a more expansive view towards these types of endpoints, which will help us convince the clinical programs here that this is less of a risk for them, that this is something that not just could benefit them, not only benefits them, but also comes with less risk than before. So I definitely think that the more that we can do to bring the regulatory bodies on board, the better the more adoption we will have, and we will see an exponential increase after the first few digital endpoints are approved. There'll be, you know, it'll be the floodgates opening because suddenly the regulators are on board, and this opens the door to, you know, late stage trials.
Totally agree with Ariel here. And I think that's also where we have a responsibility to engage health authorities, regulators, as soon as possible into the process. Yeah. I mean, from my experience, they really appreciate to be, let's say, have an early involvement in this definition of those measures. Yeah. I think the earlier they are getting involved, yeah, the better the confidence will also be if we are taking them onto this journey.
And I would say from a clinical perspective, you asked us the question, I think there's a couple of different ways I think about this. First and foremost is education and awareness, right? Most clinicians actually, quite frankly, are not very aware or educated about these digital measures and tools because it's not using clinical practice today, as you know. So the first hurdle is always like education awareness. The second big bucket is the level of evidence, right? All clinicians, you know, we're all taught the Hippocratic Oath says, first do no harm. So always have, again, to your point, they're very conservative, very risk averse, and they want to make sure they have confidence in the evidence to use it. Probably the biggest barrier in my mind is just implementation, which is that even if let's assume you had a drug that was approved based on a digital endpoint, let's say in Parkinson's on an accelerometer, the reality is that most of their patients are not using these tools every single day, and they are treating everybody. They're not treating the early adopters, right? They're treating everybody. So these tools have to be used by patients ubiquitously for it to really change practice, or they'll be working in 2 different worlds. They have to use the traditional tools for most patients, and they use digital tools for this 10, 20% of patients who are early adopters. So how do you drive overall utilization, adoption of digital tools that will make everything else easier? So I think that's the other challenge in clinical medicine.
Awesome. Well, thank you very, very much. I know when we prepared for this session, you know, when we were going through some potential questions, we were worried we didn't have enough for the hour, but I don't think I even got through half the questions. So, you know, we could certainly think about, you know, bringing you guys back for a second session. But thank you so much for your time. I thought this was really interesting, really valuable. The recording will be made available. And yeah, glad we sorted your audio, Ariel. It was a really, really great conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.